Montana Territory. August 1877. The sun was still high when Odessa Ellery was banished from her own wedding feast, her veil ripped from her head, mud on her skirts, and shame burning through her chest like wildfire. The laughter behind her belonged to the groom's family, cold, sharp, and full of triumph. They had never wanted her. Now they had what they wanted. She stood outside the church hall, dust rising around her boots, staring at the double doors that had slammed shut behind her. Her bouquet lay crushed in the dirt. The ring never even touched her finger. She had not cried. Not once. But her hands trembled as she walked down the road alone, past wagons, past lanterns strung from trees, past the sound of fiddles meant to play for her. She could still hear her father's voice in her head, low, ashamed, telling her she had brought this on herself. That a woman with no money, no name, and no mother had no place trying to marry into a family like the Corbetts. That they only took her in because she was pretty and quiet. And now she had neither. By the time Odessa reached the edge of town, the sky had turned amber. She stopped near a fence post, not knowing where else to go. Her hands clutched the torn hem of her dress, and for the first time her breath hitched. Then a voice behind her. Low, steady. You planning to stand there until night swallows you whole? Or are you hungry? She turned fast, startled. A man sat on the back of a wagon, a tin plate resting on his knee, steam curling from a pot swinging over a small fire. He wore a dusty black shirt, sleeves rolled, a worn hat tilted back on his head. His face was tan from the sun, a scar ran along his left jaw, and his eyes, the color of iron, didn't waver. Odessa stared at him. My name's Vaughn Zeller, he said. I do not care what happened back there. But I will not let a woman sit in the dirt while she's starving. She didn't move. He grabbed a second plate, scooped stew into it, and set it on the edge of the wagon bed. Sit, you can eat, or you can keep standing in that dress like it means something. She walked forward, sat. Picked up the plate. The first bite filled her mouth with salt and heat. She didn't look at him, but she knew he was watching. Thank you, she said quietly. You got a name. Odessa, she said. Odessa Ellery. You planning on going back? She shook her head. He nodded once. I have a cabin, he said after a moment. North of here, half a day's ride. It ain't much, but there's a roof and a second bed. You are welcome, but I will not touch you, not unless you ask me to. She looked at him then. His face was serious, but there was no greed in his eyes. Just something steady. Something that felt like safety. Why would you offer that? She asked. His jaw flexed. Because I have eaten alone too many nights. Because I know what it is to be thrown away by people who think they matter more. And because you deserve a place to belong. She stared down at her plate, her throat thick. Come with me, he said, softer now. Let me put you at my table. She didn't answer. But when he stood and offered her his hand, she took it. They rode out at dawn. Vaughn gave her his coat, and she wore it over her torn dress, holding the reins with stiff fingers. They said little. The wind moved through the pines and birds called overhead. Odessa did not know what she was now. Not a bride, not a wife, not a daughter. She was nothing. But when they reached the cabin, tucked between a ridge and a slow-running creek, Vaughn opened the door and said, Welcome home. She stood in the middle of the room, swallowing hard. The place was simple, one large room with a bed in each corner, a table in the center, shelves lined with jars and tools, and a small wooden cross nailed above the hearth. It smelled like cedar and clean air. Sit, he said, and pulled out a chair. She did. Then he served her from a pot he had left simmering over the fire. She ate. And she didn't know what made her say it, but as she set down her spoon, she looked up at him and said, You called me your wife. He met her gaze. Yes. Her voice was barely a whisper. Why? Because I meant it. She stared at him. I do not need a preacher to tell me what I already know, Vaughn said. You were thrown out like garbage, Odessa. That does not mean you are worthless. It means they were fools. I saw you standing there and I thought if no one else will choose her, I will. Her heart beat too fast. You do not owe me anything, he said. But if you want to stay, then yes. You are my wife. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, her voice was steadier. Then I will be. The next days passed quiet. Odessa swept the floors, helped stack firewood, learned where everything belonged. Vaughn showed her how to patch a saddle, how to feed the chickens, how to tell weather by the smell of the wind. He never touched her, never asked. But one night she stood at the table drying dishes and said, "I want to sleep in your bed." He turned from the fire slow. "Are you sure?" She nodded. He walked to her gently. "I will not hurt you," he said. "I know." That night he held her like she might break. He didn't kiss her, not yet. But his arms around her were warm and strong, and she fell asleep with her head on his chest, feeling safe for the first time in years. By the next week, the town had forgotten her, but she had not forgotten herself. Vaughn came in one morning, dust on his boots, and said, "Heard they are saying you ran off with a drifter, that you shamed the Corbetts." She laughed once, sharp. He grinned. "I told them you are not a drifter's woman. You are my wife." She looked up at him, and something broke open in her chest. Later that day she kissed him, and he kissed her back like he had been waiting his whole life. They did not speak of love yet, but it was there in the way he held her hand as they walked by the creek, in the way she sewed new curtains for the windows, in the way he carved her a chair that fit her just right. She was not banished anymore. She was chosen. And Odessa Ellery Zeller was not going anywhere. The first snow came early. Odessa heard it before she saw it, the hush that settled over the land just before the flakes began to fall, soft and slow, as if the sky were breathing out. She stood on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the white gather along the split-rail fence, the roofline, the shoulders of the pine trees. Vaughn came up behind her, his footfall quiet on the steps. He carried 2 pails from the creek, the water sloshing gently with his stride. "You'll freeze," he said, setting them near the door. "I wanted to see it fall," she answered. He untied the scarf from around his neck and draped it over hers without asking. It held the smell of wood smoke and leather. She didn't pull away. Inside, the fire he'd built that morning was still burning strong. She set about darning a pair of his socks by the hearth while Vaughn worked the blade of his drawknife over a thick branch at the table. He was shaping something long and even, his strokes slow and deliberate, shavings curling away like ribbon. "What is it?" she asked after a while. He glanced up. "A handle for the axe." The old one cracked near the base. She turned her attention back to the sock in her lap, the needle slipping through wool. "You always fix things yourself. No one else out here to do it." She nodded, then hesitated. "Did you ever live in town?" "Years ago," he said. "Didn't sit right with me." She waited, but he didn't offer more. He rarely did unless she asked, and even then his answers came plain and short. But she'd learned to hear the weight between his words. "Why not?" "Too many voices," he said, setting the blade down. "Too many folk talking just to fill air. I'd rather hear the wind." She smiled, not looking up. "I like the quiet." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You never talk about what came before." "I don't see the use in it." He nodded once, then returned to the wood, but his movements had slowed. That night, she woke to the sound of the storm pressing against the windows. Vaughn's arm lay heavy across her waist, his breath warm against the back of her neck. She didn't move. Instead, she whispered into the dark, "They told me I would never be enough." He stirred behind her but didn't speak. "They said I was too plain, too poor. That I should be thankful to be chosen at all." His hand slid up to her shoulder, steady. "I believed them," she said. "For a long time. Silence stretched out between them, deep and full. "You are not plain," Vaughn said, voice rough with sleep. "And you were never the one who should have been thankful." She turned to face him. His eyes were open, catching the firelight. "I didn't ask you for this," she said softly. "No," he agreed, "but you stayed." She reached for his hand beneath the covers and laced their fingers together. He didn't let go. By morning, the snow had stopped. A white hush blanketed the land. Odessa stepped outside to feed the hens, boots crunching through the drift. As she scattered grain, she caught sight of a small figure moving along the ridge trail, someone on foot, head bowed against the cold. Vaughn came out behind her, rifle already in hand. "Stranger." She nodded. He handed her the rifle and walked forward alone, his posture loose but watchful. The figure came into view, a boy, maybe 15, wrapped in a coat too large for him, face pale with cold. He stopped when he saw Vaughn, hands raised to show he carried nothing. "I ain't here to steal," he called. "Just hungry." Vaughn didn't answer at first. Then he turned to Odessa and said, "Bring him in." She led the boy inside, helped him peel off his wet coat, and poured him a bowl of leftover stew. He ate with both hands around the tin, eyes darting toward the door like he expected to be chased out. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elias." "Where's your family?" "Gone," he said, not meeting her gaze. She didn't press. Vaughn came in and closed the door behind him. "Storm'll keep him here a day at least," she nodded. "He can sleep by the fire." That night, she brought out an extra quilt from the chest and laid it beside the hearth. Elias watched her with wide eyes, then ducked his head. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Later, as Vaughn banked the fire and Odessa washed the last dish, she looked over at the boy sleeping curled small beneath the quilt. "We can't keep him," she said quietly. "No," Vaughn agreed, "but we can give him a warm meal and a safe place to sleep." She dried her hands and turned toward him. "You do that for everyone?" "No," he said. "Just the ones who remind me of someone." She met his eyes. "Me," he nodded once. She stepped closer, touched his face just below the scar. "You don't have to fix everything. I know. But you try anyway." He caught her hand and kissed her palm, slow, deliberate. She leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest. She didn't say what was rising in her throat. Not yet. But she knew it was coming. And when it did, he would be ready to hear it. Elias left after the third morning, boots tied with twine, a sack of food slung over one shoulder. Odessa stood in the doorway as Vaughn handed him a flint striker and a folded scrap of oilcloth. The boy nodded once, not quite able to meet her eyes, then turned and walked into the trees, the snow crunching under his feet until the sound faded entirely. Inside, the warmth felt too still. Odessa washed the tin dishes in silence while Vaughn checked the snares he'd set the day before. The light outside had thinned to that brittle gray where the sun never quite broke through, and a draft slipped between the floorboards with a sound like breath. By afternoon, the wind picked up. Vaughn came in with his hat dusted white and his gloves stiff with frost. He set down a brace of rabbits, then shook the snow from his shoulders. "Creek's icing over," he said. "Won't be long before we haul from the well instead." Odessa nodded, pulling the rabbits toward her with practiced hands. "I'll clean these and salt what we don't use." He watched her for a moment, then turned toward the stove. "Been thinking," he said, voice even. "About what?" "There's a man west of here near the Bitterroots. Name's Combe Riedel, has a forge, trades iron for pelts and dried goods. Could use a new stirrup and some nails before spring." She paused, wiping her hands on a cloth. "You're leaving?" "Just for 3 days. 4 if the pass is worse than I remember." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she folded the cloth, laid it flat. "You ever traveled with someone before?" "No," her fingers stilled. "Then maybe it's time." He leaned one hand on the table, brow drawn. "You want to come?" "I don't want to stay behind," she said. "Not again." Vaughn studied her, then gave a single nod. "We leave at first light. You'll need every layer you've got." They packed in silence. Odessa wrapped beans and lard in wax paper, tucked them into a saddlebag alongside a tin of coffee and a wrapped biscuit of lye soap. Vaughn checked the horse's hooves, restitched a strap on the bedroll, and rolled the map back into its tin case. At dawn, they rode out. The trail west wound beneath black-fingered trees and up into low ridges where the wind cut sharper. Odessa rode behind Vaughn, her scarf pulled high, her breath fogging in the cold. They stopped only to water the horse and eat jerky hard enough to crack teeth. At night, they camped beneath a rock overhang, the fire throwing long shadows onto the snow. She lay wrapped in blankets beside him, her body close to his, not for warmth, but because the space between them had grown too small to carry silence. "You ever think of going further?" she asked into the dark. "Further than Montana," she nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Used to think about Oregon," he said. "When I was younger, before I learned running don't always fix what's behind you." She turned toward him. "You left something behind." He was quiet. "I left a brother," he said finally. "Younger than me. Took a bullet in Missouri during the war." "I wasn't there." Odessa reached for his hand beneath the blanket. "You couldn't have stopped it." "No," he said, "but I still carry it." They didn't speak after that, but his fingers curled around hers and stayed there until morning. By the third day, the snow had thinned and the trail turned rockier. They passed a ridge where a hawk circled overhead and descended into a narrow hollow. Smoke rose from a low roof tucked beside a stream, and Vaughn raised a hand in quiet greeting as they approached. Combe Riddell met them at the edge of his forge, his beard thick with soot and his sleeves rolled high. He had the look of a man who didn't waste time on greetings, but he nodded to Odessa and said, "You'll be the one keeping him steady these days." She met his eyes. "I keep the fire lit." Combe gave a grunt that might have been approval and gestured toward the bench near the anvil. "Trade what you brought." "I'll check my stock." While Vaughn and Combe haggled over lengths of iron and a cracked rasp, Odessa walked beyond the forge where the stream cut a narrow path through the trees. She knelt, touched the surface with one bare finger. The water was cold enough to sting, a voice behind her. "He's different now." She stood, startled. It was Combe, wiping his hands with a rag. "How so?" she asked. "Used to come through here once a year, never said more than he had to. Eyes like winter. This time he looks like he's found something worth staying for." She didn't answer. Combe folded the rag and stuffed it into his belt. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." That night, they stayed in the loft above the forge. Odessa lay beside Vaughn, the soft creak of the rafters above them, and whispered, "I don't know what I thought marriage would be." He pulled her close, her head beneath his chin. "What do you think of it now?" "I think it's two people learning how to carry each other." He didn't speak, but she felt the way his breath caught. They rode home the next day beneath a sky turning clear. The trees sparkled with melt and the trail seemed easier somehow, the cold less fierce. As the cabin came into view beyond the trees, Odessa slowed her horse. Vaughn turned in the saddle. "Something wrong?" She shook her head. "No," she said. "It finally looks like mine." By January, the snow deepened to the porch rail, and the wind came with a weight that rattled the eaves through the night. Odessa learned the sound of each draft in the cabin, each creak in the boards, each shift of the fire when the logs settled. The land had pulled in tight for winter, and so had they. She had begun writing in the evenings, small entries on scraps of paper Vaughn traded for along with lamp oil and flour. She didn't call it a journal, too fine a word for something so plain, but she kept it folded in the back of the ledger drawer, where only she knew to look. One morning, she found Vaughn standing at the window, his hand resting on the sill. Outside, the snow was high enough to bury the fence line in the east pasture. "What is it?" she asked, brushing flour from her hands. He didn't turn. Tracks headed toward the shed. She stepped beside him. A single line of prints crossed the snow, narrow and fast, disappearing behind the barn. "Coyote," she guessed. He shook his head. "Too light. Maybe a dog, wild or starved." That evening he brought in more wood than usual and stacked it by the hearth without speaking. She didn't ask. Instead, she pulled the kettle closer and sliced the last of the dried apples into the pot. As the stew simmered, she sat near the fire and began mending a tear along the shoulder seam of Vaughn's work shirt. He watched her from the table, his hands idle for once. "You ever think on what you missed?" he asked. She kept her eyes on the needle. "What do you mean?" He leaned back. "You were meant to be married. There would have been a house built on his land, children maybe, church picnics, neighbors who spoke your name like it belonged." She finished the stitch and bit the thread. "That life was never mine. It was offered." She folded the shirt and set it aside. "An offer isn't a promise." He didn't answer, and she stood to stoke the fire. "I think on what I gained," she said after a while, "not what I lost." He looked at her then, the way he did when he was trying to find the edge of something she hadn't said yet. She met his gaze. "You gave me something steadier than a name." The wind knocked against the walls again, but he didn't move. Then he stood and crossed the room to where she stood by the fire. "I can't give you much more," he said. "But I'll give you everything I can." She reached up and touched the collar of his shirt, her fingers brushing the warm skin beneath. "I don't want more," she said. That night she lay against his chest, listening to the slow rhythm of his heart. She didn't sleep right away. Instead, her hand rested over the small ridge of a scar above his ribs, and she thought about the first time she had seen him alone beside the fire, steady as the mountain behind him. She had thought then that she was ruined, that being cast out meant she'd carry the shape of rejection inside her forever. But now, with his breath steady against her hair and his arms snug around her waist, she understood the truth of it. She had not been ruined. She had been unclaimed, and he'd claimed her not with words but with care, with presence, with the way he always left her the last of the coffee and the way he never let the fire go out. The next day the dog came back. It was just before dusk, when the sun was sharp and low. Odessa saw at first a thin creature, ribs strung like wire beneath its coat, one ear torn, limping through the snow with its nose low to the ground. She opened the door and stepped out slowly, a piece of dried meat in her hand. Vaughn was at the edge of the porch, his rifle lowered. "Don't rush him," he said. She knelt in the snow, holding the meat just above the ground. The dog paused, ears back, then crept forward inch by inch. When it took the food from her hand, its teeth grazed her skin, but it didn't bite. That night the dog slept near the hearth, curled tight as a knot. Vaughn raised an eyebrow as he watched it settle. "You naming him?" She brushed ash from her skirt. "Only if he stays." "He will." Vaughn poured 2 mugs of tea, handed one to her. "Strays know when they've found something better." She sipped the tea, the warmth biting at her tongue. "Like you did?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, "No," she looked up. "I didn't find something better," he said. "I found what I never thought I'd have." She reached for his hand, and he let her take it. Neither of them said the word love. Not yet. But it hung there between them, heavy as the snow on the roof, waiting to settle in its own time. The thaw came slow that year. March brought more gray than green, and the ground stayed hard beneath the sunless sky. Odessa dug out the seeds Vaughn had traded for back in autumn, brushing dust from the linen sacks as she laid them out on the table: beans, squash, onions, and a few precious kernels of corn wrapped separately in a twist of waxed paper. Vaughn looked up from oiling the saddle. "You think the frost'll let go in time?" She touched the edge of the seed sack, feeling the weight of it. "We'll plant late if we have to, but we'll plant." He leaned back, dragging the cloth slow over the leather. "You ever kept a garden before?" "No. But I watched my mother do it." She didn't say more. He didn't ask. That night, the dog who had taken to answering to the name Flint lay stretched in front of the hearth, one paw twitching as he slept. Odessa sat at the table, sorting the corn kernels one by one into a wooden bowl. Vaughn rolled up the map he'd been studying and set it aside. "You ever think about naming the land?" he asked. She looked at him, surprised. "Why? Everything worth keeping ought to be named. Means someone claimed it on purpose." She considered that. "I'd want something that fits, quiet." "Steady," he nodded. "Like you." Her mouth curved barely. "Like us." The next morning they walked the length of the field together, boots crunching through frostbitten grass. Vaughn carried a post driver over one shoulder, Odessa a coil of twine. They marked the rows slow, measuring each step. When her fingers stiffened from the cold, he passed her his gloves without a word. "I've been thinking," she said as they worked, "about building a smokehouse. If the rabbits are good again this year, we could keep more for winter." He glanced over. "You want to?" "I do." "Then we will." That was how their days went, small choices, shared without ceremony. A life made in pieces, each one placed with care. One evening, as the last light faded over the ridge, Odessa stood behind the cabin, watching the sky turn to ink. Vaughn joined her, pulling the shawl from his shoulders to wrap around hers. She leaned against him, the scent of pine thick in the air. "There's something I want to ask you," she said. He waited. "If I were to get with child," she said softly, "would that frighten you?" He turned to face her fully, his hand settling at her back. "No, but I'd want to be enough." "You are," she said, voice steady. "You're already more than I ever thought I'd have." She saw it then, the way his jaw eased, the way something long held inside him gave way. He brought his forehead to hers and breathed deep. "I love you, Odessa," he said. "I don't have fine words, but I know this. I wake and sleep beside you, and I never want to do it alone again." Tears pricked her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I love you too, Vaughn, and I'm not going anywhere." They sealed it with a kiss, slow and sure, the kind that didn't need more after. In the weeks that followed, the earth softened, and seeds took root. Odessa rose early to check the sprouts, her palms always dusted with soil by midday. Vaughn repaired the roof and split enough wood to last into summer. Flint kept to the porch when it rained, ears twitching at every bird call. One Sunday, Vaughn brought out a crate from beneath the bed, a pair of books, one about wild plants, the other a tattered volume of poetry. He set them on the table without comment. Odessa opened the second and read aloud while he carved fence pegs, her voice filling the space between them. By midsummer, the garden had taken hold. Corn leaves reached higher than her knees, and squash blossoms opened wide in the morning sun. Vaughn built the smokehouse with her beside him, and when the last stone was set, they sat together on the grass, hands linked, watching the chimney take its first curl of smoke. That night, she pressed his hand to her belly as they lay in bed. "I think," she whispered, "I might be carrying." He stilled, then looked at her, eyes full of something deep and quiet. "We'll build a cradle," he said. "I'll start it tomorrow." The months that followed passed with the rhythm of growth. Odessa's belly swelled, the seasons turned, and the land gave back what they had sown. Vaughn added a shutter to the window nearest the bed, so the light wouldn't wake her too early. Flint grew old enough to limp in the mornings, but still barked at the hawks that circled too low. When the baby came, it was late September. The air was sharp with the bite of fall, and the trees had begun to turn. Vaughn stayed beside her the whole time, his hand clenched in hers, his voice low and steady. The child entered the world red and howling, lungs strong, fists curled. A girl. They named her Clara. Odessa held her close near the fire that night, Vaughn at her side, and felt something settle in her chest, something sure and full. She looked down at the baby, then up at the man who had chosen her when no one else had. "We have everything now," she said. He touched her cheek, then kissed her temple. "We always did, we just didn't know it yet." Years passed, but the rhythm remained. The cabin grew by a room, the garden stretched wider. The smokehouse stood firm through every season. Clara learned to walk between rows of beans, her fingers always dirty, her laugh echoing across the field. Odessa taught her daughter to plant, to read, to listen when the wind shifted. Vaughn showed her how to hold a hammer, how to track a rabbit, how to stand still long enough to hear the creek speak. They lived slow. They lived full. And through every day, Vaughn and Odessa never forgot the shape of their beginning, how one act of kindness became a life. How love, when chosen quietly and held steady, could grow into something unshakable. They grew gray together, side by side. And when Clara married and built her home just beyond the ridge, they watched the smoke from her chimney with contentment. They did not speak often of the past. But sometimes, when the light was just right, Odessa would take Vaughn's hand as they sat on the porch, and he'd squeeze it just once. They had been cast out once, both of them, but they had built something lasting, and they had been loved, wholly and without condition, to the end.